We're now live.
Okay, we are live. And next on the agenda is Chris Campbell, who I remember when we were setting this all up, and I think most of us know more now than we did then about telecommunications. And he was our expert. So Chris, the floor is yours. And I think we are really interested in lessons learned. What you learn, things, we should avoid, things we should do, anything you think we should hear.
Okay, great. Thank you. My name is, for the record, my name is Chris Campbell from Montpelier. I'm here at the request of the committee to discuss the bills and the proposals in front of you. I think most of the people, many of the members of this committee have at least a little bit of knowledge of my background. There's a few who haven't, and it's been a while since I testified before you. So I want to just give you a brief overview, reintroduction. I actually had intended, I don't have a presentation to give you, so I'm here mainly to take your questions, but time permitting, I can also offer you some thoughts on a few aspects of the bills that I've reviewed. All right, so as I said, I'm in Montpelier. I grew up originally in Colchester. I spent about 18 years in Vermont state government until 2015. The last 5 of that was as the 3rd executive director of the Vermont Telecom Authority, 5 as telecom director at the Public Service Department, and also about the same amount as telecom planner at the Public Service Department, responsible for the Vermont Telecom Plan. I also coordinated energy and broadband efforts within the Economic Stimulus and Recovery Office during Tom Edslin's time there during the Great Recession, and was briefly assistant CIO for the state. And since 2015, I have been a principal consultant at Tilson Technology Management. Tilson is a national firm with headquarters in Portland, Maine, that designs, builds, manages, invests in, operates, and consults on information infrastructure. It's involved in fiber, wireless, IT systems. While I've been at Tilson, I've had responsibility for advising both public and private sector clients. That's included state broadband programs in New York, Pennsylvania, and West Virginia, municipal and regional broadband efforts. Private investors are looking to make investments in broadband infrastructure. We've had our clients in Vermont have included the groups that went on to form Lamoille and Northeast Kingdom CUDs, Southern Vermont, and Central Vermont Fiber. Some of that's been consulting, some of that's been things like poll surveys. Also, Tilson now has an in-house ISP, Tilson Broadband, that is a recipient of a CARES Act funded connectivity initiative grant, and has been deploying and standing up operations for in Danville, St. Johnsbury, and Lunenburg in the Northeast Kingdom. And that's a fiber to the premise network. However, I mentioned all of those Vermont entities in Tilson. Today, the remarks I'm giving, the perspectives are my own personal ones. I'm not speaking on behalf of Tilson or any of the CUDs. Although I know that Tilson Broadband is on your agenda later in the week, and Ellen Katz, my colleague at Tilson, will be speaking then. So that's the brief introduction. And the context. Let me just actually make just 2 points, pause and see if there are any questions, and then if you want me to proceed, I can start to elaborate on a few other themes. So from my time at the VTA, 2 sort of top line things that I would stress as you sort of consider creating a new or a revived state telecom authority. One is to be really clear about the role of an authority. What's it for? What's it there to do? To be clear with yourselves and to be, clear with other telecom actors in the state. One of the things while I was at the VTA that we experienced a lot of tension around was the tension between revenue bonding and competition, right? So one of our principal financial instruments was meant to be this ability to enter into revenue bonds. But one of the things about revenue bonds is that they require revenue, right? And where are you going to get revenue from, right? You're going to get revenue from users. And there was a real understandable direction to focus on the most unserved areas. So those also happen to be the areas with the worst business cases, right? Where obtaining that revenue was going to be, in a strong business case was going to be the most difficult. I think you have the ability with, significant federal funds now coming down the pike to, to create business cases that have more reinforcement to them and and are not solely dependent on that borrowing and bonding. But being really clear about what you expect the authority to do. If you're expecting them to focus in areas without any option, making sure that they have the financial resources to do that. If you're expecting them to kind of live off the land, understand there's going to be some competition potentially in making that business case. Second thing that I would really stress is I think as you go into this, understand that Vermont really needs a sustained effort on this part. We absolutely need to get things done in the next 2 years, in the next 6 months, in the next 3 years, 5 years. But I think that in order to have ongoing success as a state in addressing our telecommunications infrastructure and services need, we just need to recognize that telecommunications networks like our electric grid, like our roads networks, are infrastructure that we need to sustain. And this isn't something that we should try to stand up an organization only to stand it down 3, 5, 8 years later. We may want to plan for some transitions in that organization, but really telecommunications is an area where the needs of the state are going to continue to develop. Some of the ways we can forecast it a little bit, but some of the areas we're not going to be able to completely foresee. And really, you're going to be able to attract higher quality people, higher quality partners, when what you're engaging in is a sustained effort to invest in the infrastructure and services that that bring telecommunications broadband to the state. Let me take a pause there and see if there are any questions or particular areas that the committee would like to dive into.
Any questions at this point? Senator Sirotkin.
Senator, I can't hear you.
I'm unmuting myself.
There you are.
Do you have any general thoughts for underserved areas, whether it should be a competitive model, a monopoly model, a private-public partnership?
What I would say is that, let's just sort of answer the first part of the question. I think that the economics of rural telecommunications networks at the physical infrastructure layer, the fiber, the fiber, the poles, the wires, those sorts of things, really tend towards having only one network that can be economically viable, right? You can have multiple networks, but the financial viability of them is going to be hard for multiple networks to thrive. It's not necessarily true in more urbanized areas, but in rural areas, it's hard to have multiple networks that are really doing well financially. And so, one of the things that I've seen in Vermont, and I see really across the country in my work, is that communities either choose their networks explicitly. They say, this is the kind of network we want to, we want to have. These are the kind of services we want to have. We're going to put our money there. We're going to, spend money to build the thing and, and take and benefit from the services, or they make it by default, right? That, there is whatever network and services that can sustain itself the best and sort of wins out, is the one that does. And that sometimes aligns with what the community would want for itself, and sometimes it doesn't, right? So I think that probably the case where this is the best example of this when it comes to fiber networks, which have really high initial costs, right? And have relatively low operating costs compared to other networks, but attaining a certain amount of recurring revenue. If you don't get that, you have a very expensive piece of infrastructure that people aren't benefiting from. Really, you really want to be on the other side of that equation, which is you have a really high quality, capable piece of infrastructure that people are broadly sharing in the cost for. The other part of your question, went to really kind of what's the model for how this is done. And there isn't really one single model out there. I mean, there are plenty of examples of private companies who have built out these networks, maybe because they've been there before, maybe because they're associated with an affiliated business that has a lot of connections in the community, like electric utilities or electric co-ops, or because they get provided the incentive to do it in terms of substantial grant funding. When you also see public models for this, and in those public models, generally the public entities that are most often the success. Again, there isn't one universal law about how to do this, but most often either those are entities that already have experience operating a network services. So one of the more common examples are electric utilities, right? Public electric utilities. Or it's a model that's operated in a public-private partnership, where most often the public entity is a funding and financing vehicle, but they have a contractual relationship with a private entity that brings operational experience and know-how and ability to actually provide the broadband service that rides on the infrastructure. That's the most common model.
Thank you.
Okay. Any other questions at this point? Okay, Chris, it's back to you.
Okay, well, so let me take kind of at a high level, what's an authority good for? What's its job, right? So sort of getting to my first point. So I tend to think about this, that an authority is best suited for things that are closer to the doing end of the job, right? Building things, pursuing funding opportunities, borrowing and lending against assets and revenue stream. And so these were many of the things that the former VTA was empowered to do. But things like revenue bonding, infrastructure ownership, facilities leasing, though a lot of those powers have been sort of pushed down to the local level through the creation of CUDs, and that's good. There's some good in local community buy-in and priority setting. The CUDs also have a key power that the VTA never had, which was they had the power to actually do the thing that you're interested in, which is get broadband service out to the end user. Retail service was something that was never part of the VTA's toolbox. So in the House bill, the new authority that they created, in my interpretation of this, is they're primarily set up to provide money and help make the CUDs successful, but want an organization that makes sure that the plans are well vetted and that the CUDs have professional support and expertise that'll help them be more successful. This is understandable. We've got one really mature CUD, EC Fiber, and we've got a whole bunch of other ones that are still relatively young and growing, and we don't really have time to wait 5 years for 3 or 5 years for them to mature. We want to get something done sooner. And to my mind, it does make sense to have an organization that I really think about it in terms of like a shared services model, almost. You're building the capacity, in a centralized way, instead of having that capacity duplicated in a lot of different organizations. I think one thing, when you think about, if you're thinking about it in that lens, thinking about staffing and resourcing the a centralized authority, you want that to be really capable. This isn't going to be an organization that just gets by on 2 people and is effective. And if you staff it effectively, it can be more cost effective than necessarily duplicating every single one of those functions out in these other organizations throughout the state. And if you think about it, that also provides a potential, one of the potential transition paths long term for a state authority, which is, you provide this large slug of money that's passing through the system, and just like you have shared services organizations like VEPSI for municipal electric utilities. There's probably on an ongoing basis, without taking over all of the functions of these CUDs, it probably is a role for some shared services support on an ongoing basis. The other thing that I think is really, it could be a useful role for a state authority to play in this vein is being a vehicle for combined action, going after opportunities together that are bigger than one CUD. So, some examples of this. There's going to be additional federal money through the NTIA that's for public entities and public-private partnerships, right? So, could you put together, a Vermont approach to that the same way 12 years ago we did a Vermont approach to that on smart grid? There were real benefits to that approach to the smart grid. I think there would be real benefits to an approach today like that on broadband. And then also, the amount of money that's contemplated in the House bill, I think is, a lot closer to the magnitude of the problem that we're trying to solve. 150 is probably closer to the magnitude than $20 million of. I think it's enough to create some more viable business cases. It may very well not be enough to solve the whole problem by itself. So the question is, how do you extend and expand upon that with other sources of funding? And I think about a need to have people who are expert in finance and deal structuring, who understand the technical aspects of these networks really well, and who can structure public-private partnership deals that can bring in additional sources of outside money. So those are some of the things that I think, if you're creating an authority, you might think about, oh, these are the kinds of functions that we would want an authority for. Senator Hardy had asked a question earlier in the session about, do a lot of states have authorities? We get exposed to a lot of states in our work, in my work at Tilson, and I would say a state level authority that acts in the manner of an authority the way that I've described it is actually pretty uncommon. However, Vermont's a small state, and what's somewhat more common are authorities or authority-like structures at the local or regional level, right? And many states, a regional entity, might be closer in size to the state of Vermont than the state is in terms of its overall size. So some of the things that I think that are under consideration that I don't think that either aren't necessarily well aligned with an authority or aren't necessarily well aligned with an authority. One is general telecom policy and regulation. The telecom plan, setting state broadband goals. I think this is an area where actually having a little bit of separation between policy and regulation and the implementation is helpful. I think policy and implementation, needs to take into account, both what the public entities are doing and what the private entities are doing. And I think it actually is helpful to both parties to have a little bit of functional separation between those roles. I also think that, collecting data on ISP service and publishing unserved area maps, an authority should be a voracious consumer of that information, should provide some of it, but it's also going to require input from other parties. And I think it's also an example of where it's helpful to have a little bit of a separation of roles, to have, somebody like the Department of Public Service, is one of the functions that they're doing now. I think it's helpful to have that, not necessarily have an authority have that job. In the area of broadband grants that are generally available, as opposed to the House approach where they're really targeted to a particular set, the CUDs, but it's sort of a general broadband grant program. I think that could go really either way, and there's some advantages and disadvantages either way. It's definitely most states that I've worked with. Actually, I take that back. Pretty much all states that I've worked with, don't have an authority the way that these bills sort of constitute an authority running a broadband grant program that's sort of generally available to all ISPs. And having helped other states and having run broadband grant programs both at the VTA and at the Public Service Department, there's nothing inherently that requires the authority to run that kind of broadband grant program. And there's some advantages, again, in the separation, avoiding perceived conflicts between grants that are made and the authority's own projects. On the flip side, arguing for the other side of the argument, there are some efficiencies of expertise and information that an organization gets by actually going out and building things that are valuable insights to programming. One of the things that, one of the ways I sort of described our approach when I was at the VTA is we had a little bit of a build it or buy it approach. We had both tools. We could build infrastructure where we felt like that was most cost effective, was likely to produce the best outcomes, or we could, grant money to CUDs, to private ISPs, where that was likely to be the more cost-effective approach. So there are some advantages to having both tools in the same toolbox there, and also the flip side of avoiding perceived conflicts is that it sort of encourages a coordinated approach where the more entities that you have responsible for managing the funding that the state is putting out there, the more likely it is you're going to get examples of lack of coordination. You see, plenty of examples of this at the federal level where you have, 3-4, different agencies giving out broadband money in one form or another.
Okay, Senator Hardy, you have a question?
Yes. So, Chris, thanks for being with us today. I appreciate your specific advice about what should and shouldn't be under this authority. That's helpful to hear. I'm curious your thoughts on the sort of focus of the authority. And the House bill focuses, ooh, Senator Sorokin's outside. That looks nice. Anyway, the House bill focuses specifically on broadband and not the sort of broader telecom, which my understanding is what the former VTA did or was supposed to have done. And so what are your thoughts about that specific focus versus the broader focus?
Yeah, I think this is another example where there's some pros and cons, right? So I think that on the pro side, having kind of a laser focus on broadband will bring more focus to the organization. I think one of the things that was perhaps not fully appreciated by all the way through the existence of the VTA is that we spent at least half of our time on cellular. And by the way, for a variety of reasons you probably don't have time to go into today, rural cellular is a lot harder to move the needle on than broadband. And we could spend a whole session on that, on why that's the case, but it's much, much, much more difficult. You have many fewer good options for how to make progress on that. So I think, if you were to narrow the focus to broadband or broadband first, right, you might gain a greater amount of concentration on a singular problem, right? And really nailing that problem and not necessarily distract the organization with a problem that is going to be hard to solve. On the flip side, rural cellular is a real need, right? And it's a need that I don't think is going to be especially well addressed by many of the current actors, public or private, in the telecom space. There are structural issues that lead to, and structural and very understandable reasons why national cellular companies have a strong incentive to place as their first priority expanding capacity to serve existing customers rather than expanding coverage to serve unserved customers. And there is no reason to believe that on its own, that's going to change anytime soon. And Vermont's not special in that way in any regard, right? It's like, this is exactly the same dynamic. And this is not to say that national cellular companies never build or expand their networks in rural areas. They do. But there's this really massive need and drive to service the investment that they have where most of their customers are. And there's just massive amounts of investment that's been required to maintain reliable service and upgrade that service in the areas that they already serve. So I honestly think that rural cellular gaps are a structural issue, probably going to be with us for a long time, and will be with us longer if we don't have somebody working on it with some tools in their toolbox. So even though I would say right now, broadband's probably our bigger emergency, right? And probably deserves a lot of focus. I actually think that something that is and not a bad thing in S18 is that there's there is a something in there about mobile. I think it's there's work to be done to sort of build out that approach, but I don't necessarily think it'll look like a carbon copy of our approach on broadband, and I don't really see the existing actors having great tools to put a dent in that.
Okay. Any other questions? Not seeing any. Chris, are you finished with your presentation?
I'm happy to make some other comments.
Okay, no, yeah, we have time. So
you have time? Okay.
I'm gonna cut you off around 3:30 so that Holly gets a chance to talk.
Good. I know Holly's coming after. I didn't want to leave her time to provide her remarks. So a few other implications. So one of the things that I think you really will have to wrestle with here is the bill that's coming out of the House is I think was accurately described as taking really a strong focus on supporting the CUDs, and I think it's also true that in some cases, the best and most cost-effective option for expanding broadband in a given area is going to be a private provider. One of the ways I framed this in my testimony to the House was to take a really broad view of partnership, public-private partnership. That can mean some very specific things like, operating a CUD network or design, build, operate. But I think it could also be, extending a private company's network in an area where that's just the most pragmatic solution. So I don't think it's necessarily a choice between choosing between the CUDs and private ISPs, in every case. Elaborating on some of the staffing and capabilities. Is some of the examples of things that I think that a CUD should be able to do is help to structure partnership, vendor, and financing opportunities. There's a lot of work that goes into finding the right partners, vetting them, negotiating an agreement, turning that into a legal document. And once that problem is solved, there's an opportunity to have it be much cheaper and more efficient and more effective to do it the second time around. So I think that's a place where instead of having everybody having to create their own template, there is an ability to do it once and to reuse that work. The other thing that important thing that I stressed in the House, and I think there's I actually think it's an intention of the bill that's coming out of the House, but I think it would be helpful to make it even more explicit, is allowing and empowering a state authority to be the lead applicant and implementer of projects for grant opportunities, especially federal grant opportunities. I think you heard Tom Eveslin talk about, in the Great Recession, the ARA program, some of those funding programs kind of did an end run around the state. And they required the organization that received the grant to do the thing, right? To actually, provide broadband service. I'm not necessarily suggesting that a state authority all by itself, kind of completely independently, should be the entity that does, for instance, what the CUDs are empowered to do all by themselves. But I do think that there's a very real possibility that there'll be federal funding opportunities that may require there to be a lead entity, and for that lead entity to be empowered, if necessary, to do the thing. Now, that doesn't mean that they need to do the thing all by themselves, nor am I suggesting, as I said, that they should be doing it all by themselves. But if you can have the authority being empowered to do the thing, where that's a requirement of the federal funding opportunity. Again, doing it in partnership, doing it in cooperation with other organizations. I think that's an area where you can strengthen that. Couple more specific points. If the Senate bill has a grant program, the Vermont Telecom Authority has a grant program that is available to more than just CUDs, whereas the House bill takes an approach that primarily works through the CUDs. If you ultimately decide on that approach, to have a grant program like in the Senate bill, one very specific change that I would recommend is, right now the initial language has small eligible telecommunications carriers eligible to receive those grants by right, and all other ISPs eligible to receive those funds by discretion. Really, there shouldn't be any difference between those two groups. There are really a wide diversity of ISPs serving rural Vermont today. If somebody's bringing you a proposal under a grant program that's solving the problem and meeting the criteria, they should have the same right to be eligible to it as the next organization that's over there. I think structurally, where you're setting up an organization that is giving out funding in a competitive grant program. In general, it's better to not have potential recipients, employees or those with a financial interest sitting on the board that's making those awards. This is something that I see play out in a number of states, and to be honest, different states structure this differently. Some have a complete separation between, the industry folks who are potential applicants and, a board or council that's awarding it. Some of them explicitly put industry representatives on it. Generally, I feel that I've seen it work better when there's that separation between, the potential applicants for the funding and the people who are making the decision to award it. The last thing I'll say, and then I'll give some time back to questions or over to Holly, is I think in the House bill that there's some really intriguing language about training employees, which I think is a good thing to think about in terms of the whole package here. I would encourage you, if you're going in this direction, to think about not just existing employees, but potentially new hires, new skill training. There are examples of companies who are probably going to be growing, and private companies and public organizations that are going to be growing in the state of Vermont who are going to need people with skills. Across the country, there's going to be, I think, demand for people who can build these networks. Right now, for some projects, Vermont's an importer of labor on this, because you can oftentimes find people locally to do it. You can't always find all the people that you want to do it locally. It'd be great if, Vermont had more people in state who could meet those needs locally, and maybe even to a greater extent be an exporter, not of the people, but have people who are from Vermont do work and bring some of those dollars back into the state.
Okay. Any questions? Senator McDonald. You're muted, Senator.
Many folks like that.
I'm amongst them.
Mr. Campbell
Hi.
talked about having investor-owned utilities and CUDs compete for the grants, and if they could, have the capacity to do the construction, then they should be equal. What requirements would they have to meet other than simply making the construction? How would do they get to decide where to go? Can they charge whatever they want? Do they have to have open access, or could you have conditions that go to both of those groups that both groups had to meet?
Yeah, good question. So let me clarify and then approach that question from a couple different angles. So I haven't really today taken a firm position on whether the money goes in a grant program where the CUDs compete with private providers or not. What I am saying is whether you choose that route or you choose to go through the CUDs that take a broad view of what private partners can bring, and sometimes it's going to make sense, I think, even if it were to go through the CUD, where the partnership might be, helping to fund a private provider where on a route where extending the private provider's network is the most cost-effective thing to do. So what are some of the things that you would do if the money were going to a private entity? I mean, in general, I would say, if you're awarding money, you should try to keep the criteria fairly similar, between entities. And in general, simplicity of requirements, not no requirements, but simplicity of requirements and simplicity of complying with those requirements attracts applicants, and complexity and uncertainty repels them and ultimately makes it more expensive. So in general, some examples of grant program requirements that I think are pretty broadly adopted by states and go down pretty well are things like, reporting on broadband availability, obligations to, offer the services provided for a certain period of time, verification of speed and quality of the service, having, reasonable charges for connections or line extensions in the grant-funded areas, having obligations to, reach a certain percentage of, even very high percentages of addresses, in the areas where the awards are made. Pricing is always a difficult one, because this is an area where, kind of pricing of the recurring charges, because broadband ISPs aren't rate regulated. It's a non-starter for a lot of them to be rate regulated, but a soft and I think actually pretty effective version of it that I've had success deploying when I was at the state in Vermont and have recommended to other states, when they have similar questions, is a requirement that comparability, the prices that you offer in the grant funded area are not going to be different than what you're charging, somewhere else, unless that's sort of explicitly baked into the grant agreement. And then, kind of looking at what the applicant's history is, right? So generally speaking, you can get a pretty good idea of what to expect by, what has been done. And for most ISPs, they actually don't want to offer a different price in a grant funded area than they do, in a non-grant funded area. So that one's usually a pretty, that's a condition related to price that tends to be more successful at being sustained.
Okay. One more. I've got 2 minutes, and then we're going to move on to Holly. So have you got another question?
Several, but this is not the time to ask them. Thank you.
Okay. All right, committee, any other questions? Thank you, Chris. That
Welcome.
gave us a lot to think about. We may ask you to come back as we think.
Very good.
Thank you. Holly,
Hello.
welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair. And Chris, it's lovely to see you. We had some real adventures together at the VTA.
Good to see you too.
I am going to share my screen, if you don't mind. If I can find the right presentation. Thanks. Now, the one thing, can you see that?
No, Faith, have we made Holly a co-host?
She is a co-host.
Okay, so you've got the tools.
Okay, well, I did hit shared screen. Faith, if there's something more I need to do?
Hit shared screen and then select your application that you're going to Zoom.
Yep, did that. Okay. And
Holly, if you want to send it up, there you go.
here we go.
Oh, it's up.
Okay, very good. Let me see.
Bad internet connection. Slow.
It says that for me?
No, that's what I'm saying. It just took a while to get it up there.
Well, the good news and the bad news is that I've organized my comments to make them as concise as possible by using this PowerPoint piece. And the bad news is that I would prefer to be looking you in the eye, and it's hard to do that when you're sharing your screen. So if you have a question, please shout out and stop me. I have been here before, but for the record, my name is Holly Groschner. I'm a telecommunications lawyer by training with over 30 years of experience in private and public networks. And I'm going to emphasize my background just a little bit because it turns out that I'm one of the few people around who has worked in commercial networks, telecom, and in the public sector at the VTA in telecom, and as a lawyer supporting deals on both sides. So I was a director at Downs, Racklin, and Martin in the utility practice. I cut my teeth with John Marshall on Hydro-Quebec and moved on from there to broadband and then mobile and cellular clients. I was a vice president of legal at a place called Crown Castle International. I did $4 billion worth of tower transactions. That is a network provider that supports mobile phone companies. We bought towers from Verizon, Bell South, AT&T. In fact, we bought towers internationally and provided the network on which telecom was provided. And you may know me most recently as the now retired CEO of Vermont PBS. And one of the reasons why that's a telecom job, frankly, is because PBS has a lot of great towers in good locations. So one of the things I did was manage those towers for communications companies. And you may know that we sold some spectrum and funded $50 million worth of service to the television station to ensure the longevity of public media for Vermont. Recently, I've become a nonprofit volunteer, both at Equal Access to Broadband, where I'm board chair, and I'll talk a little bit about that, and EC Fiber. I'm the Corinth representative. I live in downtown Metro Cookeville in the town of Corinth. And yes, yay. Hi, Senator McDonald. And that has been a real eye-opener. For today's purposes, however, I'm the former general counsel of the Vermont Telecom Authority. I did work under Chris Campbell. I came in right after Mary Evslin's tenure was over. And I was the person who wrote the contracts. And sometimes, unfortunately, the person who enforced the contracts. I needed to understand the scope of the VTA's authority. I advised the board on some of their authority. I understood quite a bit about state law, telecom technology, and documenting standards for grant performance. I assisted in contract negotiations, but I did not decide what projects would be funded. That was the board's job. So I analyzed House 360, and this is my conclusion in the context of my VTA experience. If I could impress just one thing on you, I would suggest that the commercial telecom world is more or less completely unresponsive to public purpose funding. I really want that to sink in. You know, I worked a lot with giant telecom corporations for about 10 years and more as their lawyer. And I can tell you that their motivations for return to their shareholders, their motivations for competition and increasing technology to the areas where they make their biggest return, that's where their attention is focused. In Vermont, at 623,000 people, we are basically a rounding error. And it's not going to pass their notice that not only do we not matter in terms of the revenue we produce for those companies, but we also have very expensive build environments. So Vermont needs, in my opinion, Vermont scale projects and participants, and they need to be held accountable with transparency. So my thought is that if you want to make change in the broadband environment, you focus, and you focus on an appropriately scaled Vermont solution. I think House 360 does that. So I think I mirror some of Chris Campbell's comments that an authority like that really doesn't need to be drafting the telecom plan or building maps of existing resources or any of the other things that take its eye off the ball of creating projects that solve the problem. I think it's pretty appropriate that the sunset here is 2029. If I had my druthers, I'd figure out a way to suggest to you a sunset that was tied to a deliverable standard. Like, we'll stop doing this when everybody has 100 megabits squared. But it'd be a little bit optimistic on my part. So 2029 seems like a pretty good window. I also applaud the articulation of performance standards. This happens at section 8086. 100 megabits per second, affordability, shared facilities. The reason why it's helpful to put that in the statute is because when you don't, what happens is the potential grant recipient wants to negotiate with you, and they want to negotiate it out of their performance objective. So anything they can get out of performance reduces their cost, and it isn't going to reduce their bid. So when you make an authority like the VTA have to negotiate individual standards, the carrier can easily walk. There's no obligation to them to do this project unless they're beholden, as a CUD is, to find that partner who will work with them. So by putting it in the statute, you've made it more concrete. I also thought that House 360 did a good job of putting the CEO of the VCBA in charge. The CEO is hired by the board. The CEO hires vendors and staff as he or she needs them. This is important because I think that this organization becomes highly politicized really readily. And you need to find a person and trigger that person's ability to get stuff done. And so keeping the politics to a minimum becomes really important. And there's something that I didn't put on this list that I should have. And that is very different from what Chris Campbell is suggesting. I don't see anywhere in House 360 where it says that the VCBA builds stuff. I don't think the VCBA should build stuff. I think the VCA should get stuff built. And the reason why is because there is a ton of effort that goes into not only negotiating the grant and service agreements, but then also negotiating construction agreements, negotiating to have the right personnel on staff to manage construction, as well as oversee programs. And I think, again, this just complicates the mission. What happens when you lose absolute laser focus is that the efforts of the VTA becomes diffuse, and then they get criticized, and then they slow down, or they have to have a bunch of priorities at once. And when that focus starts to fail, what you're going to have is a status quo. It's just how it works. So a few recommendations. Here's my handful. 8087 is a section that talks about pre-construction grants. I think the criteria for those pre-construction grants are pretty darn complicated. I think you want these guys running out of the gate, not dinking around trying to figure out who gets how much. So that's one thing I think we should fix. Section 8085B and 3084 talk about proprietary secrets or proprietary information. I'm kind of a curmudgeon on this subject, I have to tell you. These are areas that we're looking to serve that the commercial carriers have not chosen to serve for over 20 years. Over 20 years. And if a commercial carrier comes forward and says, oh, what we do is highly proprietary, I say, oh, bunk. If you want public money, you can be completely transparent with the public and with the VCBA about what you're doing. And I think that these CUDs are going to need to understand what is going on and see what deals can be made out there. And by doing that, we will have a higher standard overall of the kind of services that we're able to acquire through this funding mechanism. I also see that the VCBA is tasked to look at affordability, and we've used the affordability word for years, but we have never defined it. And back in the VTA day, affordability was really kind of meant don't charge more than you charge everybody else. And for goodness sakes, since we're helping you fund this, maybe you'd even think about charging less. But a carrier can't create a system where they charge some folks one thing at one address and other folks another thing at another address, unless it's part of a generalized plan. My thought on affordability is that the VCBA should build affordability into its incentives in creating grant projects. So if you're going to charge less in the end than the next guy, well, great. That's something we should consider in awarding that grant. But the VCBA, and this is an important point from my point of view, should not just be focused on construction. It should also be allowed to award money that's built for affordability planning. Affordability requires planning, and it requires delivery mechanisms. I'm going to talk a little bit about that, but the VCBA needs a little bit more authority in order to do that. One of the things that happened at the VTA, I can tell you, is we spent hours and hours with state lawyers and state departments, not the State Department, but state agencies, haggling over whether we could have access to government property, state right-of-way, state buildings, state lands generally. And what was really going on there is while broadband was important, it wasn't that important. And it may not have been the priority for whoever the agency head was. And their interests were always greater than our interest. We can't have that this time. This is a once in a millennium kind of funding opportunity. We need to really make the whole system called the state of Vermont work towards this goal. So I think it would be appropriate to give the VCBA projects the right to access state properties in consultation with others. Right now, the statute just says, oh, the VCBA can talk to state agencies. It's not enough. Lastly, I'll say that section 7515B, which talks about the connectivity initiative, something I know almost nothing about because it was created after I went off to do other things, should maybe be held to the same funding objectives as the VCBA's section 8086. There's two different sets of standards. Why not make them the same? I agree with Chris Campbell that working out the VETA piece and getting rid of the bonding, let's think up a bonding mechanism by the VTA, getting rid of that is important. And I absolutely love the tax exemption for electric utilities. Making them a partner in these projects is nothing short of genius. So in summary, the VCBA is like a bigger, better VTA from my perspective. It's focused, it's a bit more insulated from politics, it sets some specific grant objectives. I would recommend that it have authority for an affordability planning grant, that it have access to state properties, and that it limit the amount of secrecy or proprietary and encourage transparency. So while I was at it, I took a peek at Senate 118. And in my mind, these are mirror image bookends. I find it, in order to make real change, it's a bit too diverse in its objectives. And I remember sitting there at the VTA and having a couple of things like this happen. You know, people were upset about mobile, and Chris is right. Mobile companies really are hard to deal with. And yet, so we had the mobile, we had the broadband, we had the state telecom plan, we had to ensure that we got a good report in so that we could get funded. And then there was unhappiness with the governor and with some of the grantees. And by the time you get all of that noise going all at once inside the authority, you start really getting some very difficult conditions under which to deliver something consistent. I also see that the Bill 118 requires sustainability and competition. And I'm sorry, we're talking about areas that are not commercially viable. So I think that's a pretty tall order. Sunsetting the initiative by 2026, again, creates a certain amount of just bedlam. I think Chris referred to it as needing a sustainable longer-term initiative. So I agree with him on that. There's some issues with how the board's formed. Chris mentioned that. And then there's this piece about what I think of as who's in charge. The governor hires the CEO. The authority, which means the board, hires vendors and staff. And then who is it that runs the broadband core? I'm completely confused on that. So I do think there are some things that need some work. Okay, so before I go on, I did think that the broadband core was a very interesting opportunity. And I thought we ought to talk about that and affordability a little bit more, because it is the one thing that seems to be kind of missing in H360. But before I go there, we had some conversation about partnering and partnerships with commercial providers. And it might have been Senator McDonald who brought this up. This occurs at section 8085.3, where the VCBA is supposed to help CUDs partner with providers or commercial ISPs, internet service providers. Well, I got to tell you, as a lawyer, that makes my hair stand on end. Municipalities don't have the same DNA as commercial ISPs. And to try to make them marry as partners is just a bit wonky. So I would change that word to collaborate, or in the case of EC Fiber, you know, it's a vendor relationship. And so that is perhaps a word that's just too loaded with meaning. And so it's just a practice point that perhaps that could be modified a bit. So now I'd like to move on to the subject of the broadband core. And really what we're talking about there is affordability. Public investment in broadband shouldn't happen unless we can't have a possibility of connecting everyone. It seems right-minded to me. And never again should we see a scene like this one, where, you know, the kid's stuck in the car doing homework all day, or somebody's at their local hotspot for the day trying to connect to work. That just seems like we've seen it. We should avoid it. And this is an opportunity to fix it. So that's great. But the And the broadband core that Tom Evslin has spent quite a lot of his focus on, and he and Mary has started a new nonprofit to address, does address the emergency situation by grabbing a share of the federal funding to build a strategy that reaches low-income families fast. Tom and Mary also confirm that the plan is short-term, but it doesn't require that a funded commercial ISP provide subsidy. It can't. It does suggest that a commercial ISP might be the source of subsidy, and if we happen to be working with that commercial ISP, we might put a proviso in the grant that they have to have a subsidy. I'd like to talk a little bit more about that. This is the current state of the map for CUDs in Vermont. Isn't it amazing that citizens across Vermont have come together to organize themselves to get additional service or to help impact the kind of broadband service that they have? I find that kind of a specific Vermont event. So last year, EC Fiber funded a new nonprofit to study affordability in communication union districts and to make a plan. And they did that to resolve the needs of their neighbors in their member towns. Why? Because schools were coming to them and saying, you've got to do something. We need to connect these kids. I ended up volunteering as chair of Equal Access to Broadband. And when we looked at this whole situation, we talked to schools and we talked to social services agencies, the community action programs and others, and we made 4 important discoveries. The first one, and I just want to make sure you know about this. The first discovery is that national commercial carriers, whether we're talking about Comcast or Starlink or CCI, are not required to set subsidized rates for low-income families. They're not required to have a subsidy program at all. That's because they're unregulated. They participate when it's economically advantageous. The second thing we found out is that there's no national subsidy strategy. Congress, the FCC, they have an emergency broadband benefit that they're working on right now after a year of a pandemic, but it's temporary. And it specifically precludes small carriers or others that didn't already have a subsidy program in effect in December. So what the FCC did is they said, let's use Lifeline. It's a familiar program to the big national carriers. We can get the money out really fast. And the big national carriers, if you want to participate, you sign up and we'll send you up to $50 per household per month for subsidized service. But that completely left our small carriers out of that initiative, and now they're talking about expanding it. Low-income households, and this is probably the most important finding when we were talking to the folks at EC Fiber because they were so unaware of it. Low-income households don't access broadband on their own. It takes a trusted relationship through a caseworker or a school worker to encourage expenditures in new technology. Now, that was almost enough, but then we found that in talking to the experts, the caseworkers that do financial counseling for these families, that about $22 a month is as much as those families could handle. And that actually isn't all. You need to plan for arrearages because you will have them. You know, the tires go out in your car and all of a sudden you miss your payment on broadband. You need somebody who understands how to navigate the landlord. And some of the power programs we have do that, navigate the landlord who does or does not want to give the broadband company access. And then this is a very transient community. So there's a lot of relocation issues. It's clear that broadband equity requires policy and planning. And I agree with Tom Evslin that where low-income households are included in existing networks, it actually increases the financial value or viability of that network. And that where no network is available, a cost-effective and immediate service strategy is necessary if one is available. But that doesn't mean that we can just ignore establishing a broadband subsidy strategy and a delivery program for broadband subsidies. I sort of went over this. I know we're getting close to the top of the hour, so I'm going to be brief. You know, today affordability is just left to the commercial carriers. And if you're a low income family, you're like, where do I get service? No one tells me. I'm afraid of the bills. Carriers control whether I'm even qualified to get access. When will they make the delivery? It's up to my landlord. It's up to the carrier. I have no idea. And I don't know what devices or what service requirements I have. Nobody is there to help. So through EC Fiber's funding, Equal Access to Broadband is pulling together this plan. We think it will cost $5 million over 4 years. It works with the community action agencies to create a process for engaging low-income families. It builds in the cloud a data tool for agencies and schools so that they know who the provider is, and they can issue a work order to get service to that family through this tool. They don't need to make it a harassing multiple call initiative. We're formalizing caseworker training so caseworkers understand what broadband is and understand what they need to inform the individual family to do. And we're helping build a subsidy with local ISPs and CUDs, a subsidy plan. What's the business model for your subsidy? How are you going to access federal funding? How are we going to get that service to the family? All of that needs to be worked out. But it doesn't need to be worked out over all of those CUDs you saw. We could work it out once, have a centralized model, and have those CUDs and ISPs share in the cost of that plan. Again, just to reiterate, the community action agency relationship is key. Delivery of broadband service, and this is something that was news when we started talking to the CUDs about it. Delivery of broadband service is a social service. It is not a technology service. And if there's any place where the existing program run by carriers is failing, it's here. They don't treat it as a social service. There's one other thing I'd like you to know. The subsidies for the service to Vermont families cost $24 million a year. Now, part of that is being paid today by big national carriers. Part of it is being subsidized by the FCC. But if you take 40,000 low-income Vermont households and you give them service at $72 a month, which is the standard EC Fiber rate for 25 megabits square, if you're only going to charge them $22, you have to find $50. The $50 happens to be exactly what Congress set upon as a subsidy, just by happenstance. So that's a viable number. That means that each household costs $600 a month. I'm sorry, $600 a year to subsidize. Now, that's not a bunch of training, and that's not a bunch of fancy stuff in there. That's just the subsidy. So I would like to point out that Starlink in the first year costs about 3 times that much, and then it goes down to double. It doesn't matter, because if the only avenue you have to provide a low-income family is Starlink, then I guess you ought to do it. Because what's happening today is we're creating an isolated group of people. We pretend to give them benefits, but the benefits are online. We pretend to offer them public education, but they need an internet system or a broadband system to participate. We're going to have a continuing problem in democracy if we don't get connected as a community. I just have to comment a moment on this plan that is presented to closing the affordability gap on broadband. Carrier low income plans being available by 2024 really doesn't take into account the CUD build schedule. It's also true that when we look out at whether or not providers are going to participate, this came out today. This is the Federal Communication Commission reporting on how many of the carriers have signed up to participate in the emergency broadband benefit, getting $50 a month per low-income household subsidy. There's your list for Vermont. AT&T, Champlain Broadband, which is Burlington Telecom, right? Comcast Cable Communications, so a cable company. Cricket, which is I think also T-Mobile. Human IT and SelectTel, they're virtual providers. I don't know how a low-income family signs up for that. And then Verizon. I think you'll agree that there's some notable absences. Subsidies, from my perspective, just can't sunset, and they have to include CUDs. So, if building broadband is job one, building a long-term sustainable program for affordability is job two. I think it takes a $5 million education and training program for the existing social services agencies and to create this process. I think it rolls out over time. The short-term solution can go on top of that in the front end. And I think it needs to be seeded by maybe $12 to $15 million that could be used to support broadband benefits in the near term. And then some of the money that we've been using as a state for building, that should be sunset and rolled into affordability. I hope that made sense. I really am grateful for the time. I'm also grateful for the work that you're spending on this very important issue. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Holly. This gives us a lot to think about, and I hope as we work our way through, we can call on you again to work it through. Some of us are due at another meeting 3 minutes ago.
I'm sorry.
No, you're fine. I wish we could do questions, but they would probably go on for another hour. But I think if we do come,
I'm retired.
you're retired. All right. Well, hopefully you'll come back to us because we are going to start walking through this whole thing. I think we're going to start with what our goals are and what we want to achieve. And I think the witnesses today have given us some things that are not in either bill to start thinking about. I think affordability is key. If you need X number of people and you run that wire and then only half of them can afford to sign up, then everybody's lost. And
I think your point is well taken, and you can't just say, okay, take on the challenge of the most expensive place to provide service and make sure that you have in your little tiny system an affordability plan. You don't have enough network to spread the cost of that plan over.
so that's going to give us something to work on. So thank you, committee. Senator Bray, really quick.
Yeah, I was just going to say, for the first time, in a meeting I attended, I think I'm going to watch our own meeting over again. There was a lot of a lot to think through based on today's testimony. Thanks so much.
Right. So thank you. And in committee, cut yourself a little slack. The House committee only has to deal with technology, not taxes or insurance or anything else. So we're gonna focus in on this for this half of the session, and hopefully we'll get it right before we finish. So thank you, everyone. Some of you I'll see in a few minutes or a few seconds. Okay,
Ending
Faith,
live stream.